module on South Park Street Cemetery. Today we are joined by Dr. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones, who is an eminent authority on the South Park Street as well as a number of cemeteries across Britain as well as India. Dr. Jones, we would like to begin with how you came to be associated with AXA.
Yes, certainly. AXA is an association set up in 1977 by, it's called the British Association for Cemeteries in South Asia. And it was set up by an Englishman who'd been born here in Kanpur. He came out to India in 1972 and he was appalled by the awful state of old European and British cemeteries in India. They'd been more or less neglected after 1947, after independence. And in fact, there was no one to look after them. Many people think that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in England look after all foreign cemeteries. That isn't true. They only look after the cemeteries of soldiers who were killed during the two world wars. If you were British and you died before that, or during the two world wars, or after, up to 1947, there's no one to care for your grave. So we decided to raise funds, and we've been very successful. And what we do is to fund local people who want to restore cemeteries. We don't come out to India ourselves and do the work. We work through local people. And it has been very successful.
So if we talk about the Southeast cemeteries which you have worked with, what are the qualities you would find to be different when you talk about South Park Street Cemetery and you talk about the rest of the cemeteries you have come across in India?
South Park Street Cemetery is the finest and largest cemetery of Britain's in India. It's absolutely unique. There are lots of very unique features about it, and possibly the first is that strikes people. There is no church associated with the cemetery. Normally you get a church surrounded by gravestones. In this case you don't, and this is for historical reasons, that the first church in Calcutta had been destroyed by Surajudollah, the Nawab of Bengal. It wasn't until 1784 that the second church, St. John's, was set up. Obviously people had been dying before then, and it was necessary to bury them. So a rather large tract of land at the bottom of Park Street was allocated for this purpose, and the road was originally known as Burying Ground Road, and it was then on the outskirts of the city because it was considered unhealthy to bury people within, a living area, which is perfectly understandable. So it was on the outskirts of the town, Burying Ground Road it was called, and funerals used to take place at night. You would have people standing there with lighted torches and the hearses taken along horses. And the idea of having the burials at night was because they were so frequent. If you had had them during the day, people watching would have become very demoralized because the death rate among Europeans was incredibly high, very high indeed. So it's unique in that it doesn't have a church attached. It's also unique in that it is a planned cemetery on an axiometric lines. It has gradiated paths, and this isn't seen anywhere at all until Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris is set up 50 years later. So South Park Street Cemetery predates the concept of Père Lachaise Cemetery.
We have come across a range of architecture within the cemetery, which ranges from pyramids to obelisks, even family walls. What would you say about this kind of variety? There was a lot of money and a lot of labor spent on the cemetery, but at that particular time, the cemetery was closed by 1790.
It was actually a bit later than 1790. I know it says 1790 on the gatepost, but in fact we've got burials up to 1818 there. And probably if somebody had a relative, a father or a mother buried there, then they would allow their children to be buried there. So it's from 1767 to about 1818. And there's a huge variety of tombs because, as you say, there is almost unlimited money. We're talking about the tombs of really rich people in Calcutta, extremely wealthy people. There were judges and officials, traders, seamen, officers, that kind of thing. And also at the time, both labour and materials were very, very cheap. The tombs were made out of brick covered with stucco, and this is why you can build them to enormous heights, and very elaborate tombs, and these people would not have been able to afford the same thing had they died in England. It was the fact of being in India where labour and material was so cheap that allowed them to build almost fantasy tombs, if you like, extremely grand tombs.
In particular, Sir William Jones's tomb, for instance.
Yes, if we look at Sir William Jones's tomb, this is the largest and tallest tomb in the cemetery, and in a way this is fitting because he was really a giant among men. He set up the Asiatic Society of Bengal. He was a linguist. He was one of the first people to start translating Sanskrit stories and documents which before that had belonged almost entirely to the Brahmin priests. So unless you were, high-caste Brahmin, you would not have access to these fantastic stories, the earliest stories of Hindus in India. So he made available text to the common people. That was one of his great triumphs. He was also a very gifted linguist, and he was the first to notice the similarities between some Sanskrit words and some Greek words, and this led him to the theory of the Indo-European language, which gave birth both to Sanskrit and Greek. Two different branches came out like that, and he was the first one to say there's a similarity, which allowed other linguists to then build on his work. So he was, as I say, a giant among men. Cemetery, we're looking at a variety of shapes and forms. The British at that period in the 18th century saw themselves somewhat like the Romans in Britain, that is a civilizing colonial power coming in to a fairly, disparate set of people. It's, really the idea of colonialism, and with that you impose your own set of norms, you impose your own architecture. So it was entirely fitting that Britons buried here would use classical motifs, classical Greek columns, classical Roman architecture, funerary architecture. And also you have to remember that this was the age of the Enlightenment, the age of reason, and this had something to do with the discovery of ancient Egypt, with Napoleon's army going in and finding all kinds of things like pyramids and sphinx and busts. So it's a combination of that exciting period when architecture is not only looking back, but it's also trying to rationalize what is going on. And one interesting thing about South Park Street Cemetery is that you will not find a Christian cross there. We've looked, there appear to be no crosses at all, and as I say, this is because it was very much the age of the Enlightenment, of reason and rationality. And other motifs you get, in particular there's one which was quite popular, and that is a column, a fluted column, which is broken off halfway, and this symbolizes a life cut short. And again, you get the classical Roman urns, and this is looking back to the idea that the Romans cremated their dead, put the ashes in the urn burials, though in fact these are over an actual grave where people were buried. So you've got a huge variety and a lot of symbolism connected with it too. Hindu Stewart is a one-off. He was an amazing chap. He decided to become a Hindu. Now, strictly speaking, you can't. You have to be, you're born a Hindu or you're not, you're an outcast. But he followed Hindu religion religiously, I have to say. He married a Hindu wife. He would go down and bathe in the Ganges twice a day, early in the morning and in the evening when he'd finished his work. He thought English women ought to adopt the sari because it was such a lovely garment. He wanted to see them in saris, not in their very tight corseted clothes, and all kinds of things like that. So, in a way, Hindu Stewart is a nickname. We know he wasn't really a Hindu and he couldn't be a Hindu, but he got the nickname because he was so entranced with the whole Hindu culture and religion. And his tomb is unique in that it is built in the shape of a small Hindu chhatri, and there are a number of Hindu statues, gods and goddesses around the tomb, Kali, Durga, Hanuman, Ganesha, Lakshmi, which unfortunately have been stolen over the passage of time. But had you seen his tomb 100 years ago, it would have looked much more like a temple to different gods and goddesses. And I suppose one of the other tombs, which is very significant there, is that of Henry de Rosio, who was the young Bengal Renaissance poet and teacher who died at a young age, tragically. The great inspiration to people here was really, involved with Hindu reform, rather like Raja Ram Mohan Roy. So his tomb is special, and it has a bust which has been erected later there.
So if we do look at the historical aspect of South Park Cemetery or any kind of cemetery, how would you consider this particularity that a lot of the people who have been interred in South Park Cemetery have had something to do with a particular movement or rather Oriental studies or any kind of scholarly work on the colonial history of India?
Well, you're going to find this, in fact, with old British cemeteries all over India. If you look in Lucknow, for example, there are tombs there to people who took part in the uprising of 1857, officers, viceroys, people with their own particular way of looking at things. But if we're talking about South Park Street Cemetery, obviously with that number of people buried there, you're going to get different strands of thought. So you've got judges, you've got Oriental scholars, you've got de Rosio at the start of the Bengal Renaissance, you've also got sailors there. There was one to an admiral, and you've also got the rather nice tomb of Rosie Llewellyn-Jones, who was a young English lady, came out to India and died when she was only 20, it's said, because she ate too many pineapples. All right, it was cholera, we know it was cholera, but that's the romantic story. She died from a servant of pineapples. And her tomb is interesting because it has a kind of a barley sugar shape. It is an obelisk, but it's fluted. And Walter Savage Landor, the English poet, was very taken by her. He met her in England before she came out, and when he heard the news of her death, he wrote this wonderful poem, what avails the septic race, what the form divine. Something, 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 grace, Roselma, all within. And in fact, this is the first tomb that Baxter restored in 1977, and we had some money from a collateral descendant of Roselma, so it was very much a family connection. So you can find more or less anything there. Recently, an inscription was put on the tomb of Lady Anne Munson, who died in the late 18th century, and this was erected by Lady Emma Munson, who is a descendant of the family. And there was a rededication ceremony last February. So it's like there are actually family links still going on today. Descendants in England will pay to have the tombs here restored. So it's not just impersonal, there are strong family links.
So, would you be able to say something about how the cemetery was constructed? Who paid for it?
Purchased the land on what would then have been just fields or marshland, and we think it was fairly marshy because they had to construct boards going down to the cemetery. So they would have bought it, and in fact it was extended. One point, if you look at the Warden Road gate, it was extended out like that because the number of Britons dying was very, very high. And it said that the life of a European in India was often just 2 monsoons. That's literally 2 years. Of course, it wasn't just the British who came out to India for trade. In the 18th century, there were a number of other East India companies set up. There were the Danes, the Danish East India Company, and the French had their own company. The Portuguese had already been here, the Dutch were here, and even the Danes at Serampore on the Hooghly. And you do notice differences in architectural styles. of tombs, and Dutch tombs are particularly interesting because they're often two-storied. So you get the bottom story on the ground, which is like a little chuttery, and then you get a smaller chuttery above it. And I was fascinated when I was in Dhaka recently, last year, to be taken down to see a tomb in the old cemetery there, the old Lorinda cemetery, and it seems quite clear to me it is the tomb of an early Dutch trader. And I'd say it's probably 17th century. We know nothing about it, but on stylistic grounds, I think it's a Dutch tomb. And the French tombs at Seringapatam, for example, tend to be rather small obelisks set on a square base. So there are variations, and of course as you move through time, once you get into the 19th century, you're looking at Victorian or Gothic tombs. Now they do start to have crosses, very prominent crosses, and they also have statuary like angels, open books, that kind of thing. It becomes very, very different in a very short time. And in a way, that's why South Park Street is unique, because its style was fixed by the end of the 18th century. That was it. Anyone who was buried later had to fit in. So it is a unique moment preserved in time. That's what's special about it.